Well, I'm really happy to talk about this topic. This actually is one of my favorite topics to discuss. I have a lecture that I give in a couple of classes, both undergrad and graduate students on the Davis campus. So the question that I'm going to kind of skirt around today is how is food insecurity related to obesity? And this, of course, has been a very hot topic in the area of food security. So I'm going to discuss some of that in the context of what we're doing. But first, let me just briefly say, for those of you that might not be familiar with the term food insecurity, what I'm referring to here, and I'll give you a formal definition later, is really lack of access to enough food for an active, healthy life. That's the short definition of it, and we'll go into more detail with that. So thinking that's the definition, then tell me, who do you think in this country, in this United States that we live in, you know, who are those people that are food insecure, that lack access to enough food for, you know, health? Who are they? How would you describe them? And what I'm thinking maybe demographic characteristics of the population. How would you describe these people? What do you think? What are your expectations? Yeah?
Coming from those socioeconomic countries,
Some of our insecure people, they might be people coming from other countries, maybe refugees, maybe immigrants that have a low economic. Whoops, I pushed something here. What did I do? Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts? Certainly, in the country that we live in today. Well, let me show you some pictures, some slides that were taken from people that come to food pantries, to community meals, who are participating in some of the food assistance programs we have. And then let's take a look and then draw your conclusions at the end. So here at a community meal, these are some people that are coming because they don't have enough food for meals, perhaps. Also other people coming to emergency food centers. Here, these are all in the Contra Costa area. This is a food pantry. This picture is from actually American Samoa, the food lunch program, school lunch program there in American Samoa. Okay, and here, all of these people are people that are coming for emergency food assistance programs or government food assistance programs. So now, how would you describe the population? Who are they? Looking at the people that I just showed you, what do you see? You can look back. Well, let me give you some hints. You know, are they all single homeless men, maybe, or a variety of different kinds? No, they're families with children. They may be couples. They could be all races. Yeah.
aren't they like either young or old? They're not really.
That's right. They could be young. They could be old. All age groups. That's right. Good. Anything else? What about, you know, are these people thin? Are they? What a body size?
All different ethnicities.
All different ethnicities. Okay. So this is one of the hardest things, I think, sometimes to convince people that in a country like the United States, you could have food insecurity. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why we monitor it, and what the relationships that we're learning now between food insecurity, diet, and health risks. And here's the definition of terms, and this you'll be convinced this was written by a committee because it is very long and convoluted, and nothing that's ever done by a committee is short and brief. But it has been defined as food security for, and when you're talking about a household level, means that access by all members of the household at all times have enough food for an active, healthy life. And that it includes nutritionally adequate and safe foods, and it also includes being the ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways without having to steal, go to the garbage, or even go to emergency shelters to get food. And this is a very broad definition, And it's very important to understand that it has the elements of enough food, of a high quality diet. Definitions vary across the globe and how this is applied, but this is the definition that drives what we do. I'd like to begin with just a little bit of a history of how we have come to start monitoring food insecurity, because I think it's important for those of you, especially those of you that may be interested in working in the political arena, in advocacy kinds of areas. Well, back in the 80s, under President Reagan, the task force had a report that said that they thought there was hunger in the United States, but we were not able to estimate the extent of the problem. And this was back in the 80s. So if you can't tell how much it's affecting you, then it's not going to be of political urgency because you can't define it. In the late 80s, a conference at Berkeley made a conclusion. They studied this problem and felt that the major issue was that we didn't have a good way to define the problem and measure it. And so a definition was published that I showed you just recently. American Institute of Nutrition published a definition that's was a start of what food insecurity, food security, and hunger meant. Around all of this time, people were beginning to say that the concept, it wasn't just that people who didn't have access had no food in the home and were really starving and really thin. The idea was that just being worried about running out of food, being insecure, being anxious about that, could potentially also have a bad effect on people, that in and of itself. So you didn't need to get to the point where there was no food at home and thin people and all of that to have this be a problem. Just the worry, the anxiety, the conflict that might come from running low of food was also an issue. So around the early 90s, there were several groups that started to work together on ways to measure this, because what they wanted was a more direct way of trying to figure out the perception of what your household food supply, your situation is like. And this was going to require a more subjective measure of that. 1995 was the year when the government first released this 18-item food security tool that was then became part of our current population survey. And every year, food security is monitored in the U.S. And every year in the fall, the report from the previous year came out. So I had originally sent you all the report from 2010, and then I discovered about a couple of weeks ago that 2011 was out. So I quickly asked your coordinator to give you the most recent report on food security in the U.S. And there's some interesting things in there that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. 2006, the National Research Council made a recommendation that more effort needed to be placed at understanding how to get at the more severe levels of food insecurity. And since then, the government has been funding smaller projects to really try to understand the people at the most severe level. Why are they so severe? What is contributing to the real problems of child hunger in the U.S.? And then just to let you know a little bit about how, again, I gave you a brief definition, but the concept of food security is that it's a managed process. So when households face dwindling food supplies, they take steps, they make changes that help them stretch the amount of food that they have with the effort to try to shelter the children. And this is an interesting concept because it actually seems to work across many cultures, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. This is a process that many households try to do. So when everybody has enough food, they're food secure. But when they start to worry, get a little more, some things they're not able to buy all the quality of foods they want. There's a household level. And when adults are maybe skipping meals so they can protect the children at the adult level, and then at the child level is when they can no longer shelter the children are also affected. And so these were the older terms that were used in food security. And in 2006, the government stopped calling it hunger because they were real uncomfortable with the way we're measuring it. So now these levels that are more moderate levels called low food security, and very low food security if there's real hunger that's affecting the population. So this is approximately, these are the old terms if you read older papers, and in the newer reports we're reporting on food secure or more moderate, and then these more severe levels. So this is the way it reads, and we're going to take a little activity in a few minutes. I think we'll have time, hopefully, to do that. But at a marginal level, in your packets, I should mention, if you open it up, your packet, there is a handout that says food security activity. And if you pull that out, I think the last page has the items that are currently used in the food security instrument. So you can see what they are. And they're in a level, so it goes from the most moderate, or the mildest levels of food security, from the worry item. We were worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. Often true, sometimes true, or never true. At a more lower level, a little bit more intermediate, asking the head of the household, do you ever eat less than you felt you should because there wasn't enough money for food? So that's a sort of an intermediate level. And the most severe level, very low food security, an example of this is, did any of your children not eat for an entire day because there wasn't enough money for food? So this, and a lot of studies have been done with these instruments. They've been validated against diet and a lot of other measures, so we know that they work pretty well. But there is a sequence in terms of, you can see if you look at those questions, the milder ones at the beginning and the more severe ones at the end. And when it's administered in the United States, there's instructions that if the early questions come up negative, people are not worried, they're not running out of food, then you don't necessarily need to ask all the questions. There's a skip pattern to it, because obviously if you're not worried and you have plenty of food, it's probably not the case that your child are going for a whole day without eating because you can't afford food. So there's a severity that's built into it. And the important thing is to realize that all the questions are framed so that people understand that the reasons why they're eating less than they should is because they can't afford it. It's not because they're on a diet and they want to lose weight, or because they've just been so busy with all the work that they've done they just can't seem to get around to eating. It's really driven by the lack of income and the inability to afford it. Okay, so the way it's defined is there are 18 items, and if there are no positive responses to any of those, like often true or sometimes true for me, then that means that they're high food security. There's no problems, right? If they get 1 or 2 positive responses out of the 18, then it means there's some anxiety, and maybe diet quality might be a little affected, but mostly diet quality, quantity is not affected of the foods. But still anxiety is there, and that could be tension, that could be arguments in the household, that could be many other things that are happening. Just worry is not a good thing either. Low food security, and there's 3 to 7 positive responses. It depends. If this is a household that does not have children, then again, you're not asking any of the questions that relate to kids. They skip all of those if it happens to be an elderly couple, because you don't have to ask if the kids are not going without food because there are no children in the household. So the range of questions that will trigger low food security will vary depending on whether it's a household with children or not. But this means that the quality of foods and the variety is very likely to be affected, and maybe some reduced intake among adults, but probably not children. And then 8 to 18 positive responses means that there's multiple indicators of things of disrupted food patterns and reduced food intake. Now, I don't know if there's time for this activity, but I'll just explain what it is, and if we have time, maybe we'll go back at the end. This is an activity that I do in all my classes, and it helps for people to understand. It's on the food activity description there. If we don't have time, I'll just explain so you can try it again on your own. The way I usually do this is I partner up, have students partner up, and one will read the questions to the other one. The other one will think about pick one of the scenarios on the second page and respond as though they were that person. And then we calculate and see how the questions come up. But I think what we might need to do is make sure, these are pretty quick talks today. If we have time, we'll do it at the end, and I'll show you how the food security instrument works. But you could try it on your own, and it'll show you how to use this instrument and how we code it and how we can come up with the answers of how to define it. But let me give you the latest results. From 2011, this is what we currently know about food security. About 14.9% of the population is low and very low food security in the United States. That's the combined. That's the way it's reported here. And I don't think these numbers, the food secure group here includes people that are marginal. So this is not just total. This means the people that are worried still might be lumped in this 85 group. But this is the way it's reported in the U.S. And so so this is interesting when you go to other countries and people say, well, the United States is you know, really got a lot of food there, and you tell people, well, almost 15% of the public has some access problem. That makes people realize that you know, there's some inequities in the system we have. And so now this is also from the 2011 data, and you can see here that single women with children have, this shows the percent of households that are food insecure. So you can see the bars that are largest. These are the single women with children. Whoops, didn't mean to go back. You can also see that the poverty, we mentioned this earlier, people that are under the poverty line, much higher levels of food insecurity. You can also see that Black, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic groups respond more positively than white households. That's not a surprise. So ethnicity is there. There seem to be some differences regionally. The South tends to be one of the higher areas of food insecurity. And so there's a lot of information in this report, and it's really good for advocacy to see what food insecurity is happening in different sectors of the population. You can also see, I think, that that households with no children have greater food security than households with children. There's, especially you see married couples with children versus those that have none. So, so again, having children at home raises the food insecurity. So the question that people might ask, well, why do we monitor this? Why can't we just use income and poverty measures? But those measures don't necessarily account for many things, like differences in the cost of housing and the cost of food costs locally. So this measure is part of the current population survey measured every year that goes along with a lot of other economic measures that are monitored in the U.S. Participation in food assistance programs, workforce participation, it becomes a regular part. It's also part of our national monitoring system when we look at nutrition. So those surveys are done periodically, not every year. And it's also possible that recent changes in the household, like there might be a divorce, there could be a catastrophic illness that could affect someone. Those kinds of things will come up and will also affect food security. So the thinking now is getting a more, to ask directly of the household head what their situation is valuable to understand the conditions. Now, my next slide, I thought this was really cool. Let's see what you think. This is the tracking of food security since 2000, the year 2000. And you can see that for our first 8 years or so of this decade, food security sort of chunked along, funked along. This is the level of food insecurity in the United States. During the recession, in 2007 and 2008, it took a large increase in food insecurity. So this is a measure that's been validated, but now it's reflecting what's going on economically in the U.S. And both low food insecurity and overall the milder forms of it took a great jump up during the recession of 2008. But look what's happened since. It hasn't necessarily gone down. It hasn't continued to rise, though. So this is probably something that won't be necessarily shown or talked about during the presidential debates or discussions, but this is an important measure of what's happened in our country in the last 10 years. And food security is another piece of this that we've seen a rise in this problem, and it has not gone back down. It has not continued to rise, which is important, but we have not been able to lower it back to the level that it was back in 2000. So access to food assistance is very important in ameliorating food insecurity, and that's one of the reasons why it's monitored, because we want to see how our food assistance programs are working. And that's why just income alone is not good enough, because people who go to food assistance programs, they might be more food insecure if they didn't have those programs. And so that's why it's a buffer to them, and that whether it's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program called SNAP or WIC, all of those programs are very important in buffering the full impact of food insecurity in our low-income population. So in 2009, the stimulus package that came out to try to do something with this recession that was occurring included some measures that increased the benefits that were going to the SNAP, or this used to be called food stamps, they're now called SNAP. So the benefits went up and they expanded eligibility to try to take care of some of the problems. They started spending more money, more people were participating in the program, and they were spending more money on food in that program. And if you looked at the poorest level of families at that time, there was a drop in food insecurity of 2%. It's not much, but at least we know that some of the stimulus package that came out with those expanded benefits did have an impact on the very poor at that time to help them get through some pretty hard times. So this is the kind of stuff, I love this sort of information. If you're interested in more, you should go to the website, the Economic Research Service, USDA.gov, and they publish a lot of really interesting data on food insecurity, on our programs, our WIC program, our food stamp program, or now called SNAP. And you can get data also on diet trends in the United States. So they're a great resource if you're working on a term paper or project and you want to find some other places. And all the instruments for measuring food insecurity are also on the web. So you can go there and get them in Spanish, get them in English, and get the official language for the food security instruments. So let's talk a little bit now about how it could be related to health and nutrition outcomes. So the questions that you have in front of you, you can see they're all about the level of food that's in my household, whether I'm running out of food, whether I have enough to afford a sufficient diet. And so it's a very good reflection of the household food supplies. Food insecurity, as food insecurity gets worse, the food supplies within the household are getting worse. And that has been shown in many studies to affect dietary intake, dietary quality, especially in women, but also in children as well. And then of course, it's hypothesized that dietary intake, poor quality diets, will affect health and weight status. And in fact, the research does show this in some of the studies that I have done and others have done in California in immigrant populations. Lower household supplies, food insecurity is very strongly related to lower supplies of fruits and vegetables. That's one of the first things to go because people view those as being more dispensable. But as we've talked about, they're also the foods that have a lot of the phytochemicals and the health benefits, but they're some of the first foods to go, and people relying on more of the staples to get by. But studies have also shown that in households that are food insecure, there's also higher intakes of fat, saturated fat, and sweets and fried foods. Some of these foods may be very cheap. Families may be trying to shelter kids by giving them some little treats to hide the fact that some of the more expensive foods are not available. We don't really know all of the mechanisms that are involved here, but we know these are observations that in some of our immigrant populations, you have both of these trends happening. And these both could work towards a diet that's going to promote obesity. On the one hand, you kids not being exposed to fruits and vegetables, learning to like those foods. On the other hand, you have them giving them a lot of those inexpensive foods that are not very nourishing. But the problem with a lot of the research that's done to try to develop or establish a relationship that food insecurity could be a cause of obesity is that people who are food insecure live in poor neighborhoods usually, and in those poor neighborhoods there are maybe not good access to places, safe places to play outside, so physical activity may be limited. The working conditions, they're working long hours, or their working conditions are not very amenable to having to cooking, to doing healthy cooking. And there may be other things, low education. So these are factors that, in other words, poverty leads to food insecurity, and poverty can also lead to obesity. So that's why it becomes, is it the lack of food in this household, or is the fact that this food that lacks household lives in the neighborhood that has no safe place for those kids to play, so they stay inside all day long watching television? You can't separate out some of those factors very well. And so when we talk about this problem, we realize that poverty drives both of these issues, food insecurity as well as obesity. But many studies have been done on this topic, and it's been well established that food insecurity affects nutrient intakes, diet quality, especially in adults. There are psychosocial problems in children, attention, more aggressive behaviors in school, disordered eating patterns in women, self-reported health as poor or fair, mental health, depressive symptoms, and that might also affect parenting. A depressed mother and the attention that she gives to her infant, her child, and that in itself could have a poor outcome. And certainly there have been a number of studies that have shown that there's an association between food insecurity and obesity. We don't exactly know in many studies the way they're framed whether it's cause and effect, which is cause and effect, because it's also possible that the women that become very obese face discrimination in getting into the workforce. They may have health issues that make it harder for them to go out to work. So the obesity could also lead to food insecurity as well as it going the other way. Overweight and obesity has been much harder to establish in children as living in food insecure households. And there may be some reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But here's an example of some data that comes from a national survey in the United States that shows that food insecurity is associated with higher risk of some chronic diseases, including hypertension, and an increased risk of diabetes. And this is after adjusting for some of those other factors like race, age, gender, income, education, and for body weight. So this shows the level of hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of blood glucose control, being higher in the households that report food insecurity compared to food secure. And certainly a lot of research has been done about obesity and food insecurity. And so the question is, how could this be the case? What are some of the mechanisms that might explain it? And this is what people have said, that there might be periods when people are going without eating, without food, that might cause them to overeat when food is available. And this has one of the first things that motivated people to look at this was a case report that was published a number of years ago about a child that was very obese in a family that was running out of food, and that's where they began to think that maybe there was an association between children overeating a lot if they're really running out of a lot of food. Fluctuations in eating habits could result in greater efficiency that would in their use of energy. That's another hypothesis that's out there. But many people also favor this one as an explanation, that the food insecure people eat the cheaper energy-dense foods. And some of the studies that have been done at UC Davis have shown that that higher quality diet is more expensive, the diet that has the fruits and vegetables in California. And so that might be a factor that could be explaining why food insecurity is associated with obesity. If you go into low-income communities, you can certainly see that the large grocery stores, the large supermarkets that sell lots of fruits and vegetables may not be there. I'm working in Firebaugh and San Joaquin on a big project for the next 5 years. And in those communities, there are small markets. People have to drive all the way to Fresno to find the large supermarkets, and that's about 45 minutes away. So what they have are smaller markets that are in their communities. And this is probably not just Firebaugh, it's many communities in Central Valley, the small rural towns. But it could also be in urban areas where the larger supermarkets are not necessarily located in some of the poorer communities. And just an example, we talked Sherry was talking earlier about sweetened beverages when she did her discussion. The price of foods versus the energy content that is given. You can see this was published in a journal that was making an article that made the case that the expensive foods are more costly. So this compared price per energy content of different types of beverages. So Tampico, 25 at this point in time for this particular study, was 25 cents per the energy content. And you can see how prices vary. But if you go to the orange juice, which has at least it's pure orange juice, much more expensive per energy content, and then the V8 juice, even higher still. So you might be interested in some of the projects you may do to go into some communities and see what the cost per energy is of foods that are in some of these low-income communities. That would be a very good project that a student might easily take on in some of these areas and see how it varies across neighborhoods. But I want to also say, like I mentioned earlier, I have an interest in some of the other areas and in the islands. And in the territories, and this was American Samoa, there's another issue there, dependence on imported foods. And so this happens to be a warehouse on the islands where the school food the foods for the school program is stored. But this is also the warehouse that will supply the island if the boat doesn't arrive with food. So in many of the island communities in the South Pacific, they have this isolation of being on an island and having to import all the food. At the same time, and we talked about this a few minutes ago, earlier this morning, about the fast food, there's a lot of fast food industry that's springing up all over. And these are trends that are happening in the Pacific Islands. They have the added problem again of if they've lost some of their agriculture, having to import all those foods, and what do they do if there's a storm or the boats don't arrive and they run low. In fact, after I worked there in Samoa, they've begun to do some food security work in the Samoan Islands, and reportedly, the first study they did, they found 75% of the people were reporting some level of food insecurity in one of the county areas in American Samoa. So there are a lot of issues. And if you look globally, some interesting things among the countries that have both high nutrient deficiencies as well as obesity, Samoa comes up very on the list, but you also see a number of other islands. You see Fiji, some of the other places in the South Pacific. So globally looking at this problem worldwide, you have many countries that have obesity and they also have nutrient deficiencies. So why has it been harder to find a link between food insecurity and childhood obesity? Well, it could be that children are relatively protected. It may be a problem in the way that we measure food insecurity, but it also could be that it takes a long time for obesity to develop, and that We aren't going to see it in the short term, but we will see it in people that have been raised in families where there's food insecurity, that they'll start to develop that over time. Maybe you won't see it in the young children, but if they aren't developing the preferences for fruits and vegetables, if there's some food issues where there's some lack of food and there's some overeating, or the low quality diets, it may be that it takes time and we won't immediately see it in the short run, but those people may be at greater risk. So in summary, I would say that there is evidence in the United States that food insecurity is associated, although we don't know exactly if it's a causal relationship, because poverty can drive both food security as well as obesity. And I would say also that I think at this point, instead of encouraging people to go out and try to prove that food insecurity is related to childhood obesity, I think it would be a better use of time and resources to go find the ways to improve food insecurity and how to get access to healthy diet available to everyone. So that's my comments for this. And